Everyone, my name is Jorge Gonzales. I'll be presenting today over the Colorado tick fever. It's not a nationally notifiable disease. It's not a very well known disease, I guess, by common folk, me included as a common folk. But there is some interesting facts, and so I'll be starting basically just talking about the virus itself, kind of the more the names and things, and then moving into historical analysis, and then moving into transmission and symptoms, and then ending kind of on the future analysis and where we're kind of going with research. Yeah, so we'll just kind of move on here. So the Colorado tick fever is a member of the Rio Verde a group of virus, the genus of cultivirus. And it comes from a tick, right? So Colorado tick. And the tick is called Dermacentor andersoni. I'm not always the best pronouncing these names, so I apologize. The virus itself is a double-stranded RNA virus. It's a icosahedral capsid structure. From what I read, it said that it's a very large virus as compared to others, and it's a vector transmission. So it comes from the Dermacentor andersoni tick, and that tick is a part of a family of ticks, I guess, that are related to the Rocky Mountain spotted fever virus, and that is an entirely separate virus. Not to be confused with this one, it often is, but it's not to be confused here. Some of the nicknames for this virus are saddleback fever, mountain fever, and then, of course, the Rocky Mountain fever. And all of these fevers, so to speak, right, because fever is one of the main symptoms of the virus. The fevers are, I guess, it's named that for the situation, the context, the circumstance of where people encountered this kind of a couple centuries ago when we were more exploring Colorado and in those western states, in those mountainous regions where the Rocky Mountains are. And because of that, it's often confused for being just a normal fever. It's not a very deadly virus. There are very few fatalities to note. The ones that are noted have them later in the slides, and they're interesting. But yeah, so it's often confused with just general fever because the symptoms are body aches, headaches, chills, fever symptoms, and very rarely is there ever more severe symptoms. So just moving in to the incidence and prevalence, right? It is considered an endemic virus because it is concentrated in a narrow group of states and area, largely western states like Colorado, Arizona, Wyoming, Montana, Oregon, Washington. These states, and then some others, a part of Arizona, I believe, and then western Canada. The incidence is highest between February and October, with 90% of those cases coming from April and July. People who are outdoors hiking in elevation of 4,000 to 10,000 feet above sea level during those spring and summer months. The possible transmission, given the narrowed areas of possible transmission, the prevalence of the Colorado tick fever virus over the most recent decade, just 2010 to 2019, was only about 59 total cases in the region. Prior to that decade, the early part of the 21st century here, there was a study from 2002 to 2012, 2002 to 2009, by the National Health Institute and various researchers, and they went over all of them. They went over all the cases and all the states, and they found that states voluntarily disseminated information about reported cases, and because of that, a lot of the numbers were kind of thrown off, and we have hundreds of cases that are recorded over the course of the decade. So not thousands, not millions, and many of those cases, not many, but according just to the research article that I was reading, it's suspected that many of those cases might not have been Colorado tick fever, but might have just been fever, or the Rocky Mountain spotted fever because of the symptoms being so closely connected to one another. The historical perspective, there's just in the 20th century, Dr. Howard T. Ricketts discovered that the vector of Rocky Mountain spotted fever in 1906 was from this tick, the Dermacentor andersoni tick, which is later correlated to being the origin for the Colorado tick fever. This being an entirely different disease, of course. And there's actually, I believe, one of the viruses that's associated with these two is called the Rickety virus. I think that's the official name. They named it after him. And yeah, so in 1944, the Colorado tick fever was isolated from human blood after it was contracted from this tick. However, there have been no outbreaks, no epidemics, no pandemics to date, because it's an easily transmissible disease, but it's very rare that people encounter these ticks out in the mountains, and it's also just fairly rare, I guess, that people are out in these various parts without protective gear and things where they would generally be hiking and whatnot. Just kind of moving in. So the transmission here, right? I mentioned just the protective gear because it's a vector transmission, right, coming from the tick. So if you have long pants, if you have tick repellent, you're pretty much safe. However, there is kind of a cycle that we see with the virus kind of developing in the tick and taking root in humans when they encounter them, or small rodents, or mammals such as elk, marmots, and deer through a bite, right? So the tick will embed itself, bite, and then infect the person or the organism that's just come into contact with. It's not usually a continual transmission. It has been found that transmission through the blood is very rare, like being passed on to infants from a mother. And it's very rare that mammals pass it on to one another in the wilderness. Kind of just the cycle here. We see just there's the cursor. You see just we have the ticks here, and so larva to the nymph to the adult, and then we have the hiker, right, just coming across the path of the tick being infected, and we have the small rodents who also come across the path, are infected, and then the mammals, of course. This is taken just from the CDC, and in this, I mean, it says, however, these animals probably do not play an important role in passing the virus to other ticks, right? Which means just if there are fewer ticks that have the virus itself, then there's fewer possibility for somebody to actually become infected, even if they encounter a tick. So it has to be a very specific tick, obviously the Dermacentor andersoni, but it has to be one that's actually infected with the virus for you to contract the disease. And so just kind of moving into the symptoms, the treatments, the prevention, and just kind of talking about some other more notable things. We have the incubation period from 1 to 5 days before the onset of the symptoms, being fever, chills, headache, various things. Some of the more serious symptoms, but are very rare, apparently taking place between 0.5% of the people who have been infected. Some of these symptoms, these more rare symptoms, are meningitis, encephalitis, and bleeding disorders. Now, the last one, the bleeding disorders, this was the only, aside from an elderly man, there were 3 fatalities from the disease that resulted as a development of a bleeding disorder came about in the individuals. They were children. 3 children died from the Colorado tick fever as a result, from the bleeding disorder coming about. But it's very rare that ever happens. Normally people recover fully, and there is a latent reaction where you recover, and then apparently within a week, you go through a period of being relatively okay, being healthy, and then you have a second hit of the symptoms. And then after that, you have a full recovery. And that's more in a lower percentage of cases. This picture here is just an example of the skin rash that people develop from the ticks, from encounters with these ticks. And this is more a general reaction that anybody might have from any type of tick, just the rash that comes about from all the various bites and marks and things that the insect imposes on the person. However, this is a generally common symptom. It's also a sign that you've been infected, likely, or that you might have been infected by this tick. Just moving in to future research analysis. For the most part, there's not like a percentage of people who are more susceptible to this. I actually read in the CDC article that the people who are more susceptible are those who are out in these wilderness environments. So really, if you're not out there, then and you're not wearing long pants, or you're not wearing high ankle boots, or you're not using tick repellent, then naturally you're more susceptible to being bit and being infected with this, the Colorado tick fever. This is just a graph showing the months where we have the highest incidence and prevalence of cases. So because of that, there's not really high risk populations. The prevention measures are just personal protective equipment, and the treatments, there are no treatments for it because you'll typically make a full recovery. And because of that, there's not been any development of vaccines for this specific virus itself. However, future research will just determine whether or not we need to do that. Well, thank you, everybody, for listening to my presentation. Here are some of my sources. I hope you learned a little bit, and have a great day.